American pressure on Israel, not Israel, while visiting Israel, and unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel.
Hi, everyone. I am currently at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. That's why I'm not in my normal studio. And I'm honored to be in person here with my dear friend, Frank Gaffney. Frank has been on the show numerous times, and he is, of course, the host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network, and also is the founder of the Center for Security Policy here in Washington, D.C., one of the premier defense and security policy think tanks in the D.C. in the policy space. And Frank, you've been in this business in defense and security policy for many years. You served in the Reagan administration. And with all of our conversations and our friendship, one question I've never really asked you is, when back then in the 1980s, when you're working in the Reagan administration, what did Israel policy look like then? And at what point or how did you see the change come about to what it is today? Like, is there a story behind Israel policy of the United States of America?
Oh, there decidedly is a story behind it. The piece of it that was playing out while I was in the Pentagon was somebody else's portfolio. So I was kind of watching it, but mostly from afar. I worked on sort of the Soviet portfolio. I acted as an assistant secretary of defense, and the Israel and basically the rest of the world was the portfolio of a fellow by the name of Richard Armitage, who was an assistant secretary for international security affairs, as they called it. Our portfolio was international security policy, confused everybody. The point is that my perception of what was going on is kind of at a remove, but what was unmistakable is I think Rich Armitage brought to the job a certain animus towards Israel that unfortunately you find in a lot of official Washington, notably in the State Department. Rich went on to become a deputy secretary of state under Colin Powell. But he kind of, it always seemed to me, had a bit of antipathy. In fairness to him, I think that Cap Weinberger, for whom we both worked, had a bit of antipathy towards Israel as well.
Yeah, that was pretty well known at the time.
Self-hating Jew is what some people, I think suggested was the case. He was an Episcopalian, I think, during his lifetime, but he definitely felt that Israel was not the cornerstone of a sound American policy in the region. Maybe it was his time at Bechtel. There was a lot of that going on too, as you know. But whether it was the diplomatic proclivities in Washington policy towards the Middle East, or whether it was the business elements at work, during that particular period, I think it's fair to say, there was not a lot of enthusiasm about Israel as the cornerstone of our policy in the Middle East. I don't think that was true of Ronald Reagan, by the way, but these were key people shaping the policy day to day. George Shultz is widely credited with being more sympathetic to Israel. I was never quite so convinced of that.
Neither was I.
Another Bechtel guy, by the way, working in the State Department, of course. So it was an odd arrangement whereby Cap, who I loved and who I was really privileged to work with, was extremely robust and sound, I thought, on a lot of issues in my portfolio particularly. But that was always one that I didn't see eye to eye with him.
Yeah, it's interesting because at the time, like during the Cold War, relations between Israel and the United States and Israel's enemies were somewhat more simplified than they are today, in that the Arab countries were part of the Soviet bloc. They were funded by the Soviets. They were part of, everything was very binary, and they were in the Soviet orbit. And Israel was, of course, in the American orbit, and therefore seeing the Israel-Arab conflict as a front in the Cold War should seem to be a kind of obvious point. And the reason I asked you that question about how they were perceived is that, when you go back in the history of the State Department, since the founding of the State of Israel, going all the way back to Truman's decision to recognize the State of Israel, it was always the permanent State Department people who were less favorable to Israel than the elected branch. And that's why I was asking that question. So you've been in this space.
Well, and I would argue
that's
a function of the fact that elected people represent the American people. And the American people have historically, I think, overwhelmingly, including today, by the way, been supportive of the State of Israel. Those permanent bureaucrats or foreign service officers, the elite, if you will, have generally had a very different view for one of these reasons. Maybe in some places it's just out and out anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, which I consider to be the same thing. But I think there is a caveat to what you said. I think, there were some in the Middle East, notably the Saudis, who were not so much in the Soviet orbit. They were very Sharia supremacist, I call them. Still are, I think, in many ways. But they were more or less aligned with us. And certainly the Shah of Iran was aligned with us. But there were others, as you say, that bought into the Soviet sort of program and in some cases afforded them opportunities to operate in the Middle East as well. Very much a front in the Cold War, yes.
Yeah, and the analog is interesting to today, where the Chinese are behind the Iranians and funding them basically by purchasing their oil and these strategic agreements they have, who are, of course, behind all of the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, etc. And
trying to recruit the Saudis and
and trying to bring them in, and it's working. Those more moderate Arab nations that were more in the American orbit are moving closer to China now, and so it's kind of, in a certain sense, it's a repeat of that situation where there's a bloc that is aligned against the United States that is also attacking Israel, but it seems that there's less clarity now, where at the time, back in the Cold War, at least for the American people, as you said, and for people like yourself, it was very clear that Israel is on America's side, that the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of America, because they were aligned with the Soviets, and it was very clear to everyone that the Soviets were the American enemy. And today, where the U.S. is in business with the Chinese, the U.S. government is, and the U.S. government is enabling the Iranians, it's a less clear picture.
I think it's actually every bit as clear. It's just that our policies are obscuring some of the underlying realities. And this is what makes it so, dangerous, for one thing, and mystifying in others. Why would the United States government want to prop up the Iranians? I mean, if you ask the average American, I don't think they'd have a clue.
Do you have an answer for it?
Well, I personally ascribe a lot of it to just plain corruption, and also to an appetite to weaken the United States that I believe it was evident in the Obama-Biden years. And now, though it is nominally the Biden years, I think it's the third Obama-Biden term, this has become more and more and more virulently evident that they're all in for having Iran become the dominant nation in the region. Israel, if not, I hate to say this, but if not actually liquidated, certainly greatly diminished in terms of its power and its capability to defend itself, let alone our interests. Again, this doesn't make any strategic sense to me, but I think that is the policy of the U.S. government today.
So, Frank, just in the minute or so that we have left, what would be your policy prescription if you were asked by an incoming new administration, God willing, Trump wins the next election, and they wanted you to tell them, okay, how should we be handling Israel? How should we be handling the Middle East?
I basically say reboot. Do essentially what Donald Trump was doing the last time around. Recognize that Israel is indispensable to our security interests as well as a key ally, shared values and all the rest. And that Iran and the people who I think now essentially are calling the shots in Iran, namely the Chinese Communist Party, are our mortal enemies as well as Israel's. And we want to help Israel, fashion reliable alliances elsewhere in the region. But if Israel is powerful, that will be, I think, the inevitable effect of it, and it will weaken our enemies and theirs.
All right, thank you, Frank Gaffney, and thank you for watching. Frank, it's always an honor and a pleasure to spend time with you.
God bless you, my friend.
God bless.
What is it about the Holy Land? Why is the world obsessed with Israel? Why can the world turn away? See this land with your own eyes. Walk its ancient hills. Discover the roots of your faith. Meet the heroes of Israel. Stand with them and give them strength.
Be a part of the greatest story in the history of mankind. Stand with the people of Israel. Encourage God's nation, for the day is coming when many people shall go and say, "Come, let us go up to the Lord's mountain, and let him teach us his ways, and we will go in his path. For out of Zion shall the Torah come forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem."
Israel 365's Heartland Tour is the once-in-a-lifetime trip you've always dreamed of. The Holy Land is calling. Now is the time to make your dream come true.
Welcome back. I'm here at the National Conservatism Convention, NatCon 2024, here in Washington, D.C., and it's given me an opportunity to meet some of the important public intellectuals in our movement, in the conservative movement. And I'm grateful to Will Chamberlain for joining us here. Will is the senior counsel at the Article 3 Project. He's also the former publisher of Human Events and really a leading public intellectual in the younger generation in the conservative movement. Will, thank you for joining me here on Eyes on Israel.
And thanks for having me.
So, Will, I want to talk about a sensitive topic, a topic that I run up against all the time, and that is that in the conservative movement today, the younger generation seems to have this ambivalence about Israel. I wouldn't call them anti-Israel ideologically in the way that we see on the left, but whereas the older generation in the conservative movement is staunchly pro-Israel, sees the security of Israel as an American national security concern as well, and also sees that shared values in the Judeo-Christian civilization. They see Israel as a going concern. More and more when I interact with younger conservatives, they're not interested in hearing it, or sometimes they're openly hostile. How do you diagnose the current situation? Is my diagnosis correct? What do you make of it?
I think it might be your diagnosis may be a little too bleak. I think there's ambivalence is the right way to look at it among a lot of younger conservatives, and I think that's rooted in a sort of reorientation towards America first, and therefore a skepticism of foreign aid and foreign military involvement. With that said, I think there is a very, very strong America first nationalistic case to be made for the United States-Israel relationship. And I think that it's primarily a communications issue where essentially the message that is being broadcast to older generations, or the way that conservatives have talked about the Israel relationship, just doesn't necessarily resonate with younger conservatives in the way they think about politics. But talk
about that a little bit. What do you mean? I mean, because what I see is that maybe the younger generation sees being pro-Israel as like a neocon position, or maybe you're talking about that the framing of the narrative isn't right.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's that they see it as a neocon position, the sort of default, ultimately, without explanation, just sort of the assumption that they're our strongest ally, or variety of things. And I think that there's just a reflexive skepticism towards that, because the same people saying those things are the people who led us into the war in Iraq, which is obviously among younger conservatives something we're deeply skeptical of. But that's not. I'm extremely pro-Israel personally, and I see it as a very, very core American interest, even within the confines of that kind of narrow nationalistic view that our policy should be America first.
How so?
Well, so first off, obviously, Israel is historically a very strong ally of the United States, and provides a lot. There's a lot of ways in which our relationship with Israel benefits us. It's the only democracy in the Middle East, but it's the only reliable ally that we have where we can operate out of militarily. The intelligence cooperation between our countries is enormous, and we benefit very strongly from Israel's human intelligence capabilities. Their technology is top notch, and we get first dibs on all of it. I mean, I read a book that talked about the Iron Dome and how it was developed by Israelis. And it's, the fact that we have such a close relationship means we get the benefit of that sort of missile defense technology because of that relationship. I think also for those who are still skeptical about Israel and want us to flip our relationship, they're not thinking about the consequences of that for us as a country. If we were to flip on Israel, a country that's been such a strong ally for such a long time, then no one anywhere would trust us to be an ally ever. Because especially given the gravity of the events on October 7th, if we turn on an ally in such a moment of dark need, we would never have friends anywhere. Everyone would see the United States as an utterly fickle and useless ally, and would turn to China, which would not be in our interests.
So again, among this younger generation who I guess are not getting this message, do you feel that like the isolation, that there's this isolationist tendency that America first has kind of become like this fantasy that America could kind of close off all, just put up walls around us, not get involved in anything overseas, and none of it matters. And why are we getting involved in anything externally?
There's a little bit of that. I think it's just generally a skepticism of all kinds of foreign aid. I think that's the default young reflexive, like why are they entitled to our funds when we have issues here at home? I think that's the default. And I think that basically there needs to be a better justification for pro-Israel advocates about the value that is being generated for America and American citizens from what those expenditures and our support of Israel. And I think it's there. And also I think, a better job of connecting the broader pro-Palestinian movement to what the American left is trying to do to our country. Like Judith Butler famously said that Hamas and Hezbollah should be seen as part of the left. She's the ultimate leftist academic. Like, we on the right should not be helping what is ultimately a leftist project. It's absurd for us to want to do that. And I think that instead, I view Israel as so obviously like a very naturally conservative place, and very sympathetic to America First type of policies and type of ideals. They're, in fact, one of the most successful implementations. I remember when President Trump was trying to build a wall, and it was Netanyahu who said, yes, walls work. We have a wall on our border with Egypt. It works great. You should really do it. And I think he stood alone as the only major leader of any country to really support what we were trying to accomplish. Yeah,
we also have a wall in Israel around Judea and Samaria, a security fence along a lot of the areas around there that really, and that all the evidence shows that it really does prevent terrorism, really does allow you to monitor things better. Walls do work. So that's an important point. What I'm seeing a lot on the American right is also this reaction to kind of the progressive left is so dominated by Jewish voices. There's so many of the prominent people on the progressive left are Jewish. It's kind of one of these things that if I wasn't a rabbi wearing a kippah, it would sound like I'm an anti-Semite when I say it. But so many, like you have the ADL and you have George Soros and you have, Merrick Garland is Jewish and Mayorkas is Jewish. And so many of the luminaries of not only the Biden administration, Tony Blinken, but also of the progressive left in general, are Jews, and that this is kind of feeding certain tropes that I'm not justifying anti-Semitism, obviously, but it's definitely driving a lot of this negative sentiment, coupled with some old-fashioned Christian theology about the Jews that has kind of crept into the America First movement. This is what I'm seeing in the younger generation. I know that you speak to the younger generation, you interact with the younger generation. Do you come up against that stuff?
Yeah, and I think that they've really misdiagnosed the problem. And part of it is they fail to understand how deeply anti-Israel many liberal Jews are. I think that's a foundational thing they're missing. The liberal Jews that are at the top of the Democratic Party, these are people who despise Benjamin Netanyahu, work to undermine the Israeli government all the time. They are not friends of Israel in a serious sense. They basically would only be friends of Israel if Israel adhered to their norms. And the Israeli government, for obvious and very sensible reasons, has no interest in doing so. So I think that's where I think right-wingers kind of mistaken. They also do this thing where they sort of conflate. Like I remember there's some anti-Semites who are like, Talmudic Judaism is the problem. It's like, do you really think the liberal Jews you're talking about have ever read a single page of the Talmud? You don't understand the difference. Like that's as far as I understand it, an Orthodox thing, which is a much more right-wing conservative faction of the Jewish people, if you will. So,
yeah, and they also don't realize that Israel is a right-wing country. It's a right-wing nationalist country.
A deeply right-wing country.
We haven't had a left-wing prime minister since Ehud Barak, which is more than 20 years ago, and we're not going to have one. It's just Israel's a right-wing country. Yeah, so this is this is a problem that I think that the future is bright for it. From what I see, the anti-Semitism on the left is really it's part of their whole systematic way of thinking, whereas the anti-Israel or anti-Semitic tendencies that you see on the right tend to be kind of just out of ignorance and immaturity more than anything else. And my hope is that they grow out of it.
Right. I think that the really deeply committed anti-Semites will find on the right will find themselves drawn to the left. I mean, because Joe Biden is a much more anti-Israel president than President Trump was, and it's very hard for them to reconcile continued support of President Trump with this deep commitment to being anti-Israel. And but what happens is it's almost like a mind virus. They stop really caring. Some of the particular anti-Semites I'm thinking about stop caring about other issues and view all of politics through this totalizing lens that it's like every single problem could ultimately be attributed to the Jews. It's nonsense.
And we've heard that before.
Right. And yeah, obviously we've heard that before and it's led to bad consequences, but I'm not worried about it in terms of as a practical matter because I think it's ultimately very marginal. And I think most conservatives look at that and especially look at things like the Hamas encampments on all these campuses and how clearly tied our domestic adversaries are to the broader pro-Hamas movement. They're like, well, no. Israel, I want to be against that. Israel's clearly, part of the right and part of our team. And we should be, more positive towards this. Even if you want to talk about tweaking how our military aid works, it's still a positive thing.
All right, Will, just let our viewers, let the Eyes on Israel viewers know how to follow you, know how to follow your work, and thank you for joining us here.
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter at Will Chamberlain. That's where most of my communication happens. I'm also senior counsel at the Article 3 Project. You can find them at article3project.org. We do a lot in terms of anti-lawfare advocacy and fighting against all the lawfare against President Trump. And also we do congressional advocacy, and there's good ways for you to be able to participate and get into contact with your Congress people very, very easily.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Israel Bible Plus is a revolutionary way to access the treasure trove of Hebrew Bible wisdom no matter where you are in the world. With a subscription to Israel Bible Plus, you'll gain exclusive access to premium video courses from top Bible educators in Israel. These scholars will unlock the secrets of the Bible and transform your understanding of Scripture. You can't find courses like these anywhere else. But that's not all. Every month, you'll receive a new lightweight volume of the Israel Bible in a stunning full-color design. It's not just a Bible, it's a personal study companion with space for note-taking, maps, charts, transliterations. You can take it anywhere. Transform your Bible study experience today. Sign up for Israel Bible Plus and uncover the true depths of Scripture. Your journey to a deeper understanding starts right now. Sign up for Israel Bible Plus today at Israel365store.com. That's Israel365store.com. Welcome back. Since October 7th, over 600 brave IDF soldiers have given their lives to defend Israel from the evil forces of Hamas and Hezbollah. Their families are devastated, their wives are now widows, and their children are orphans. Think of Hadass Lowenstern, who's been on this show, whose husband Elisha was killed in battle, leaving her to raise their 6 children under the age of 13, including a baby, all alone. Or Neorah Swede, whose husband Bechor died while heroically fighting terrorists with his bare hands near Gaza. Neorah must now raise their 3 beautiful young daughters on her own. These IDF widows have lost everything. As they grieve for their husbands, they're also scrambling to make ends meet without their family's main provider. We cannot abandon them. Their husbands died to protect Israel and the free world from terror. Now we must protect their families who sacrificed so much. Every dollar raised pays for critical expenses like food, utilities, and clothing. Please give generously at idfwidows.com for the heroic widows and orphans of the fallen soldiers of the IDF. That's idfwidows.com. Welcome back. I'm here at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C., NatCon 2024, and it's given me the wonderful opportunity to meet in person, in the flesh, many of the leading public intellectuals, influencers, experts in the conservative space. And one of those that I've been following for a long time is David Reaboy. David Reaboy is a policy expert. He's been working in the public policy space, in the geopolitical analysis space for a long time. You've got to follow him on social media. And I'm honored to be with him here today. David.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining Eyes on Israel. So you've been around the block. You've seen a lot of changes happen in American policy towards the Middle East, and you've been watching it closely for a long time. We were told for decades that there's no way that Israel could ever achieve any peace accommodation with Arab countries without solving the Palestinian issue. We were told that if the embassy got moved, there would be World War III and there'd be, mass riots and wars across the Middle East. Donald Trump came into power and he turned everything upside down. He defied all of that conventional wisdom, and we saw that peace, in fact, started breaking out across the Middle East. But both before Trump and after Trump, we see this pivot towards Iran. Obama pivoted towards Iran. Biden, after Trump left office, pivoted back towards Iran. And it's so clear that Trump's policies work better. What was broken about that old paradigm? What was wrong about that old thinking, putting the Palestinian issue at the center of the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, where to begin with that? It's a tough question because it was all consuming, and it was wrong, and it was conventional wisdom for many decades, as you know. And the crazy part is, even that it was exposed as being a failure, as evidenced by 4 years of the Trump administration, which was doing the opposite. It's still the conventional wisdom, which is completely mind-boggling, and I think that explains what the appeal always was, which is that it was always ideological fantasy and nothing else.
So what did Obama do? When Obama comes into office, he makes this pivot towards Iran. What do you think he was thinking? What was this paradigm shift he was trying to usher in? How do you understand it?
So it's actually a tricky one because you have to reverse engineer it, and you have to look at what he's doing as opposed to what he says he's doing. And I think that was really a first in American foreign policy history, which is a president or an administration will undertake a strategy that they comprehend and understand, but they don't explain it to the public. You have Trumpism and you have George W. Bush had his particular freedom agenda, and Reagan had a very public agenda, and they explained it, and this was something that was knowable because why? We live in a democracy, and we need or we should have public buy-in over the general view of how our leaders understand foreign policy and America's place in the world. So for the first time ever under Obama, they decided, you know what, we're going to say one thing and we're going to do the other, because if we say what we're going to do, the people will throw us out on our ass.
So what do you mean exactly in terms of the Middle East about saying one thing and doing the other?
Sure. So for example, there was undeniably a pivot from our traditional longtime allies in the Middle East, which was Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, towards Iran. And if you're going to be accommodating towards Iran, you are going to necessarily harm the interests of our allies, or Iran's enemies. And I mean, there's probably no better example than Egypt of where, because we tend to think about what happened later in terms of the Abraham Accords and things like that. But I mean, Egypt was a strong American ally for many decades until the Obama administration just decided, well, okay, let the Muslim Brotherhood take over.
Right.
And one of the massive diplomatic successes of the Cold War was Kissinger shoving the Russians or the Soviets out of the Middle East, starting with Egypt. And the Obama administration wiped its hands of it, walked away, and they said, you know what, we may do better with the Brotherhood.
What do you think Obama's motive was? I mean, obviously we can't get into his head,
right?
But we also see that the Biden administration has really picked up right where they left off.
It's the same people.
It's the same people.
It's the same cast of characters. With the great exception being Ben Rhodes, who's outside but doing what, I have no idea. So he may be involved. I gather a lot of the Obama alumni are heavily involved. I mean, certainly they're emotionally invested, as we can see from their Twitter accounts. They're very emotionally invested in especially in the subject of Israel, especially in the subject of Iran, which is kind of to be expected. So I always wonder how much of a hand that they have in the functioning of the Biden foreign policy.
And it's certainly true that they've pushed the Saudis more into the arms of the Chinese Communist Party. The Saudis now don't trust the Americans.
With good reason.
Yeah.
I mean, they're trying to make up for it now because I think every once in a while, reality will hit them in the face and they realize, wait a minute, we cannot do this to Saudi Arabia because it's such an important country for us.
So right now, where Iranian proxies in Iraq are attacking American forces, which most Americans don't realize they're still American forces in Iraq, and the Shia the Hezbollah Iraq branch, which is part of Iran, has been hostile to them, and I know that they're gearing up for a conflict there. They're already, just last week there was a report came out that the Shia militias, the Hezbollah Iraq, has already said that if things escalate, or when things escalate between Israel and Hezbollah, they intend to target American interests in the Middle East. You have that going on. But at the same time, the Biden administration has refused to enforce sanctions against Iran. They allow them to sell their oil to China. And they clearly are harming their relationship with, like you said, with the Gulf states, with the Saudis. And one has to wonder, how do they understand what sound American defense and security policy is _overseas? How do they, again, I can't even imagine thinking the way they think, but why do they think that they're somehow helping American interests? Or do you suspect that they don't even care if they're helping American interests?
No, I mean, of course, I think that they believe that they're advancing American interests. It's that the way they define those interests is crackpot and crazy and full of nonsense abstractions.
For example?
For example, even getting away from Iran, going to like two-state solution stuff. Two-state solution in their understanding of the world is absolutely sacrosanct. Why? Because the way they understand the world is you make agreements based on agreements, and that's how you de-escalate, because you have an agreement. And at the end of the day, the agreement is the thing that follows where you figure out where your interests meet. I mean, that's the agreement. It's not the piece of paper that you're looking at. It's the negotiation and the give and take. And then both sides realize, okay, this is something that we can live with. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how all of this works. And
how negotiations work.
Right, exactly. And so that's why, for example, they are hostile to Abraham Accords. I mean, for a long time after the Biden administration started, they refused to say the words, because they don't want it, and it doesn't make sense to them. Their obsession with the Palestinian state is a complete and total abstraction. And, they don't understand that at the end of the day, it's all interest based. The Saudis, what they call the Emiratis, they don't care whether or not there's a Palestinian state. At the end of the day, they care about Iran. They care about their own security. They care. Yes, of course, there's kind of lip service that can be paid. But if you put this on a 900-year timeline and say, okay, in 900 years, we'll have a Palestinian state, they'll be fine with it.
Could you just tell our audience how to follow you?
Sure.
How to follow your work?
You could follow me at Dave Raboy on Twitter. I have my website. It's at the same place. If you Google, you'll find it all.
All right. Thank you very much for joining Eyes on Israel.
Great.
We'll be right back. Everyone, I'm here at the Republican National Convention. It's just a few days after the attempted assassination on the life of President Trump. And if you're watching this show, you're certainly aware that Steve Bannon is sitting in prison, one of Trump's closest advisors over the years. His crime, he defied a congressional subpoena by the January 6th committee. He defied the subpoena for two reasons. First, the committee was asking him to testify about conversations that he had had with President Trump. Bannon, of course, was advised by his lawyers that these conversations were protected by executive privilege. Second, Bannon argued that the January 6th committee was an illegitimate committee due to the fact that the Republican leader at the time, Kevin McCarthy, was prevented by Speaker Nancy Pelosi from choosing Republican members for the committee, which was, of course, a clear violation of the rules of Congress. So Bannon now sits in prison. His sentence is clearly timed to take him off the battlefield in the months leading up to the election. He is the leader of the grassroots of the MAGA movement, and now he will only be released on November 1st, 4 days before the election. At the same time, Attorney General Merrick Garland was also recently held in contempt of Congress for the identical crime. He also refused a subpoena, demanding that he hand over the audio tapes of the deposition of President Biden conducted by Robert Hur in the classified documents case investigation against Biden, despite the fact that a transcript of the deposition had already been released. Clearly, Merrick Garland is trying to hide something on those tapes that was not included in the transcript. Despite Garland's defiance of a subpoena, he's not being charged. And then there's the issue of the indictments against President Trump, all of which are absurd and fabricated in an attempt to harm his electoral chances in November. The phony charges against Trump are merely the continuation of the campaign of false allegations that began the day he took office. Remember the two impeachments while he was president? The mainstream media loves to remind us that Trump is a twice impeached former president, as though this is evidence that he's a criminal. Never mind the fact that neither impeachment led to a conviction and both were based on falsehoods. The first impeachment, just to remind everyone, was for a call with President Zelensky of Ukraine, where Trump asked Zelensky to investigate the corruption of the Bidens. This corruption is now well known to be real, as evidenced by the now validated contents of Hunter Biden's infamous laptop. It appears that Trump's crime here was that of attempting to expose the corruption of the former president. Trump's second impeachment was for the crime of publicly objecting to election results that were rife with irregularities. Nothing in Trump's objections was illegal. As Mike Davis of the Article 3 Project has put it, quote, "Objecting to election results is a crime only in Marxist banana republics," end quote. Then Trump was indicted with the crime of pressuring elected officials in Georgia to audit the November 3rd, 2020 election results in their state. Again, behavior that's permitted by the First Amendment. The charges are absurd on their face, just as absurd as the charges in the previous indictment of President Trump by prosecutor Jack Smith, accusing him of the non-crime of objecting to election results on January 6, 2020, also protected by the First Amendment. Then came the raid on Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago. The alleged crime this time was that President Trump illegally held classified documents in his home. Never mind the fact that as former president, Trump is fully allowed to have classified documents in his possession, regardless of their contents. The Presidential Records Act allows former presidents to keep classified documents, provided they're held under secure conditions, which they were. And even if they're not properly held, the Presidential Records Act contains no criminal component. The FBI raid of Trump's home was illegal and unwarranted. Now, this case has been dismissed for a number of reasons by Judge Cannon in Florida, including the evidence that the FBI and special counsel Jack Smith tampered with evidence essentially to create the illusion of a crime. Let's call a spade a spade. The United States of America has now joined that list of countries where opposition political leaders are harassed, indicted, silenced, and imprisoned for threatening the power of the regime. Anyone with eyes can see this. It's a dark time. The double standard on display in the relative treatment of Trump and his advisors on the one hand and Biden and his on the other should make us all weep and mourn for the state of America. The founders of the United States were animated by a deep faith in the values of the Bible. One of those supreme values is expressed in a well-known verse in Deuteronomy. Justice, justice, you shall pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, the opening words of this verse, justice, justice, are in Hebrew as well the same word repeated twice, tzedek, tzedek. Now, why is this word repeated? The word tzedek, justice, appears in the Torah as both a noun and as an adjective. Let me explain. Just like English, nouns can serve as adjectives when they're paired with other nouns. For example, a basketball is a type of ball. The noun basket in the word basketball serves as an adjective describing the type of ball we're talking about. The same is true of the word tzedek as it's used elsewhere in the Torah. For example, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 36. You shall have just scales, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This verse is talking about having just weights and measures. Here, the Hebrew word translated as just or honest is tzedek, the same word as in our verse. In other words, tzedek can mean justice, or it can mean just as an adjective, depending on the context. With this in mind, I'd like to suggest that rather than simply repeating the word justice, 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 you shall pursue, the verse that we're talking about should be translated as follows. Tzedek, tzedek, a just justice you shall pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So what's a just justice? What does that mean? Isn't all justice just by definition? We can answer that question by considering another verse that talks about justice. Leviticus 19:15. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In justice you shall judge your neighbor. In justice you shall judge your neighbor. Think about that. This commandment seems repetitive. Wouldn't anyone sitting in judgment be assumed to be judging the case justly? Is the Torah speaking to treacherous and dishonest judges and warning them to be honest? Commanding them to stop misusing the law? The Jewish sages of the Talmud many centuries ago explained this verse as follows. Quote, the verse states, but in justice you shall judge your colleague, from which it is derived, the court must ensure that there will not be a situation where one litigant is sitting and one litigant is standing, or a situation where one litigant says everything that he needs to say to present his case, and one litigant, the judge says to him, cut your statement short. The rabbis are explaining here that the commandment to judge everyone justly demands that there be equal justice and equal procedure under the law. For anyone paying attention, the discrepancy between the treatment of Donald Trump and the treatment of Joe Biden is clear. While there may be indictments and impeachments filled with a long list of crimes for Donald Trump and his advisors, let's make no mistake about what we are witnessing. The legal justifications for indicting Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, and others are a perfect example of justice that is not just. Which brings us to the end of the verse. Again, the verse reads, justice, or a just justice you shall pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Here again, the Bible's warning is all too clear. Without a just justice, there's no basis for a thriving society, a society blessed by God. American freedom and justice are in peril. The situation is critical. America was founded by God-fearing men who anchored their understanding of justice, freedom, and government in the Bible. These contrived and politically motivated indictments of Trump, Steve Bannon, and other people close to President Trump represent yet another way that, tragically, America is turning its back on these biblical foundational principles. Pray for America, folks. Pray for America. Thank you for watching. The Israel Bible is a window into the divine connection between the scriptures, the land of Israel, and our lives. Its illuminating commentary focuses on the land of Israel, explaining why the fate of humanity rests on this one small country, and understanding God's promises and prophecies for the end times. But what really makes the Israel Bible unique is that it was created with you in mind. Featuring insightful explanations from Rabbi Tuli Weiss and other incredible Orthodox Jewish teachers, it caters to people like us, like all of us, those who are faithful believers in the Bible, who are curious and looking to the Bible to navigate our hectic times. To purchase your Israel Bible, go to getmyisraelbible.com today.